Hosted by Aarau University in Surat, India, and Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Surat and Fountain Inn, South Carolina. So I'm Radhe, I'm the director here in Fountain Inn, and I am joined by Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko, director of our Institute of Applied Research and Integral Studies. Vladimir will be facilitating this webinar and also assisting with the Q&A. So before we begin, if we could please just have a moment of silence. Thank you. So with us here today is Dr. Michael Miovic, which I'm hoping after our discussion, Michael, I'm saying your last name close, if not exact. I'll refer to you as Michael going forward. So we are very pleased to have you with us today, Michael. I know we've hosted you a couple times, and our attendees have always so much enjoyed your talks and your perspective from a Western perspective. So as many of you probably know, Michael is a general adult psychiatrist with over 20 years of clinical experience in the U.S. in both outpatient and medical psychiatry settings. He has written a number of articles on Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga psychology and collaborated with colleagues in the U.S. and India to help develop this field. He is currently co-authoring a book with Dr. Sumitra Basu on consciousness-based psychology. Today, Michael will discuss how mental formations influence the body and limitations thereof. Before turning it over to Michael, I just want to remind all the attendees, should you have any questions in the course of the next hour, if you could kindly just put in the Q&A box at the bottom rather than the chat, and Michael will be taking some questions towards the end of this webinar. So with that, Michael, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Good noon, good evening, whatever part of the world you're listening from. Wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me. I have to say that when I received the invitation, of course I accepted, but I was a little bit nervous because the topic originally stated psychological view on transformation of the body. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to tell people how to transform the body. So I felt like, oh boy, this is a tall task. But fortunately, Vladimir later told me that I only have to discuss mental influences on the body, and I don't have to deliver transformation. So I feel much better. So there's a couple of complexities in this topic. One big complexity is that the mind itself is a complex thing, and Sri Aurobindo has written a lot about the different layers and parts of the mind, inner and outer, planes from the mind proper up into overhead planes, up to overmind. There are also layers of the mind, if you want to say, in the mental vital and the mental physical, and the mother has talked about the cellular mind. So mind is not one thing, it's all over, and there's different layers. And so some confusion comes in there when, what are we talking about, doing what? The second problem is me, which is that my own mind is a little bit limited. So, a complex topic, presented by a limited mind can lead to confusion. And we'll try to deal with that in a humorous fashion. Given that limitation, I find that, one of the most important and helpful mental formations is to admit that, in fact, our minds don't know all that much, and we should just surrender it to Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And that's an incredibly helpful mental formation to have. Even so, my job today is to study the mind, so in terms of its influence on the body. And so in the good mental way, we will be dividing things up and, classifying and kind of creating all the problems that mind creates, and then see if we can find our way out of the trap that our own minds created. So one thing I wanted to do is start by reading a quick quote from Sri Aurobindo about this topic, relation between mind and body. For those who want to know, this is from Letters on Yoga, Volume 1, page 323 and 324. Depending on your edition, page might be a little different. It's the letter on St. Augustine. And towards the end, this is what Sri Aurobindo says. Finally, the body obeys the mind automatically in those things in which it is formed or trained to obey it. But the relation of the body to the mind is not in all things that of an automatic perfect instrument. The body also has a consciousness of its own, and though it is a submental instrument or servant consciousness, it can disobey or fail to obey as well. In many things, in matters of health and illness, for instance, in all automatic functionings, the body acts on its own and is not a servant of the mind. If it is fatigued, it can offer a passive resistance to the mind's will. It can cloud the mind with tamas, inertia, dullness, fumes of the subconscious, so that the mind cannot act. The arm lifts, no doubt, when it gets the suggestion, but at first the legs do not obey when they are asked to walk. They have to learn how to leave the crawling attitude and movement and take up the erect and ambulatory habit. When you first ask the hand to draw a straight line or to play music, it can't do it and won't do it. It has to be schooled, trained, taught, and afterwards it does automatically what is required of it. All this proves that there is a body consciousness which can do things at the mind's order, but has to be awakened, trained, made a good and conscious instrument. It can even be so trained that a mental will or suggestion can cure the illness of the body. But all these things, these relations of mind and body, stand on the same footing in essence as the relation of mind to vital, and is not so easy or primary a matter as Augustine would have it. So that's just a kind of to frame what we're talking about, that there are these kind of relations between the mind and body, but that the mind clearly does not have complete control over the body under normal circumstances. And he also mentions the vital, and that's really important because the vital is actually closer to the body than the mind is, and has a very strong influence on it. And a lot of the mental influence on the body is really through influencing the vital, which then influences the body. And you'll have a later talk on that from Dr. Basu. And so there's another complexity. So Sri Aurobindo mentions here, a lot of times when we talk about mental influences on the body, we sort of automatically think, or first the mind goes to the ideas of how the mind can influence health and exceptional abilities through occult influences. And that's true, and Sri Aurobindo mentions that. Probably the most common example of that from our daily lives, and particularly in my field in healthcare, is the placebo response, which is very reliable, and a huge amount of science has been done on it, and is clinically very important because, for a scientist, the term placebo response may be a bad thing, like your treatment is supposed to beat placebo. For a clinician, placebo is really important because we want that placebo effect. And only a stupid clinician does not capitalize on placebo effects. They're very important. And a lot of that is the power of positive thinking. But I'll share a little bit of where the problem starts to get more complex from my background in healthcare. I was a psycho-oncologist by training, so I did a fellowship in psycho-oncology and worked for about 15, 16 years working with cancer patients from the perspective of medical psychiatry. And there is this long sort of, I guess if you want to call it a cultural belief or hope, that if people have positive thoughts, that they will live longer. And this has been researched a lot in oncology. And it really started with a study in the 70s where they took mostly women with breast cancer, but there were other people in the group, I think some colon cancer, and had them join support groups. And then they followed them out. And it seemed in these initial studies that the people who joined support groups tended to live longer than people who were not in support groups. And this led to the initial sort of theory that, hey, emotional, social support, having more positive perspective will make people live longer. Well, so that study was repeated again and again and again with more scientific accuracy, better controls, better randomization. And the better they did the studies, the findings evaporated. They, in fact, were not able to show any survival benefit from a mental treatment, sort of trying to affect what people think and feel, did not, in fact, seem to prolong their life. It didn't hurt anybody and it made them feel better, but it wasn't prolonging the life of the body. Now, there have been some further iterations. They're always investigating this, and now they're going down to the level of genetics. And there are some interesting studies trying to look at changes in telomeres and so on, depending on stress level and so on. And so the question is being asked and continued to be asked. But at a macro level, it's really not sort of established that, changing what people think and feel in a common way prolongs life. And another way that they looked at this that was very interesting was they looked at people who have negative thoughts. So they took out people who sort of are pessimistic and think that, or at least state, that they don't think they're going to live very long, that their prognosis is not very good, and that they don't have much hope. And they found that if they did this in breast cancer, if they took women stage 3 breast cancer who had negative thoughts versus those who had positives, they lived the same length of time. So they weren't able to show that either negative thoughts shorten life or that positive thoughts lengthen life. And this is probably just pointing to what Sri Aurobindo mentions in that paragraph we read, that there's not an automatic, immediate, and direct link between the mind and the body. It has to be established. It's a long kind of yogic discipline. And hence, the whole challenge of integral yoga. Remember, these studies are not being done on people who are practicing integral yoga or any kind of yoga per se. So, and then the other thing I have to say is that anecdotally, working inside psycho-oncology, I have to say that the people who live the longest, it seems to us, are really negative. They're the meanest people. Oh my God. The people, they just hang on. Like, the nastier and meaner their personality, they just keep going and going and going. And the really nice people, they're like, oh, they're so sweet and they're so lovely. They just pop off like that, And this is like, this is locker room talk among psycho-oncologists and people who work in oncology, like, what we see on the street kind of thing. Now, it's not scientific. I mean, maybe it's recall bias. Maybe these negative people, they just are so salient in our minds because we're sick of them. We just want them to, go away. And the nice people we really like, and so we miss them. So it could all just be statistical, games of memory. But to the degree there's something in it, I wonder if it's, these people that I meet like that, they tend to have strong vitals and they're real fighters. And it may be that vital kind of will to fight to the very end that kind of has an effect on survival. And the other reason I wonder if that's true is, now we're in the news, we're thinking about, Mr. Putin. Well, the world is full of dictators now, and there have been more and more of these people in the last 10, 20 years. And have you noticed how long dictators live? They just seem to hang on. They just keep going and going and going. I mean, these African dictators live into the 80s. And I mean, they just all seem to keep going. I mean, when do you see a dictator, drop dead of a heart attack at 50? I mean, it doesn't happen, And then we have, our own quasi-dictator, former president, who's terrible health habits, terrible diet, nothing but burgers and no exercise. And, he survived COVID just well and is keeping going. Statistically, he ought to be having a heart attack pretty soon, but, he doesn't. So I'm just kind of throwing out there that, again, the relation between mind and body may be a little more complex than we initially think. So that's one issue. Another issue that is important to throw out there is the difference between health and transformation of the body. And this is where, when I was first asked to give this talk, I was sort of trying to figure out, well, what would I say about transformation of the body, since I don't know how to do it? One thing that is interesting to note is that in normal development, for most human beings, health and physical energy are highest in youth and slowly fade over the course of life. I mean, children are famously the most flexible, adaptable, most able to heal from illness and injury, and the greatest regenerative capacities. And by the time of old age, people are very frail and brittle and have very little resilience. And so, by normal definitions of whatever the body's abilities are, they tend to decline over the course of life. Whereas in yoga, we see that generally consciousness is increasing over the course of life. And the mother even sort of spoke about this, how she said and you were reading the agenda, and she was very clear that the consciousness of her body was much bigger much more developed and greater in the last 10 years of her life than it was when she was younger. And highest at the very end, the last 4 years of her life, sort of extraordinary levels of supramental consciousness in the cells. And by any outer metric, her health was at its absolute worst at that point. So these two things are not the same. Health and whatever the transformation of the body is, they aren't the same thing. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that the transformation of consciousness goes on, really, even with the body, is quite unhealthy. It can continue. So I'll just put that aside because I don't have any answers there, other than read the agenda offered to Mother and Sri Aurobindo, because it's really beyond our minds to understand that process. So going back to the small perspective of the mind, I was thinking about, if we want to take a look at, the relationship between mind and body, what the mind can do and its limits. At a level of common sense, I want to put forth the proposition that if you survive longer, you might be able to do more yoga. So, maybe if you live to 80, you might be able to have more time in the body to practice the integral yoga and invoke the mother than if you die at age 40. So that might be one way in which the mind can help the transformation, is by sort of doing things that prolongs life a little bit. Now, I know as soon as I say that, it's going to raise a controversy, that I'm going to be accused of having promoted survivalism, when the mother can take your soul and just put you right back into a new body. And that's absolutely true. And so it's a very tentative, hypothesis that surviving might help yoga. It might not. Maybe dying now is the best thing, and mother will sort of has a plan and will take you on to the next life. And I think it also has to be said that no matter what we do, the mother is capable of saving us from our own stupidity, and she does that repeatedly. But from a common sense perspective, do we really want to make her work that much? Maybe not. So maybe we could try to just help her out with some common sense things that we could do to survive. So one way that the mind influences the body on that front, the most important way, really, is technology. Well, there's 4 areas I'm going to put out. I'm going to talk about technology. I'm going to talk about behavior. I'm going to talk about indirect mental influence and then direct mental influence. So at the level of technology, this is a big influence on the body. The mind develops technology. We developed fire. That was a huge change in sort of the body's ability to survive in harsh environments, and shelter, of course. And then another big change in technology came when the mind invented farming. That's how civilization happened. There would be no civilization without farming, because you would not have extra food to create specialists. In societies that are hunters-gatherers, people have to spend all their time hunting and gathering. So farming is a massive technology. Then, obviously another really big one is sanitation. The invention of sanitation had enormous effects on physical survival. I mean, like doubled human lifespan in the period of 50 years or something. From 35 to 40 years, people could live 70 years suddenly, if you just simply remove sewage and contamination from the environment. And then an important example of technology is this talk. We're having a talk on Zoom, which was possible 5 years ago, but we didn't do it. It was really only because of the pandemic that we started doing it. So technology has a big effect on human life, human survival, and it is part of yoga. So that's just an important point. The yoga does include technology. Another big way that linked to technology is behavior. So I'll talk again about healthcare because that's my area of expertise, and so I know more about it. But the same principles apply in other areas too. So when they've looked at this relation between mind and body, what they really found was that the most obvious mediating variable is behavior. So, for instance, if people were so depressed or paranoid that they didn't come in to get healthcare, so their cancer is diagnosed later and at more advanced stage, then they don't live as long as people who came in earlier, got diagnosed, and got treatment. And so they've looked at this again. I mean, all areas of healthcare, we know that behavior has a massive effect on how the body does. So things like diet choices, have a huge effect on the survival of the body, exercise, stress reduction, substance use. If people are abusing alcohol and tobacco, that will definitely shorten lifespan. And then another behavior is whether or not people accept to use medical technologies that prolong life, like, controlling diabetes, controlling hypertension. So those are all behaviors that are influenced by what people think, whether they believe this information about healthcare or not, whether they trust it or not, whether they decide to act on it or not. And we just had a massive demonstration of this in the COVID pandemic, where we have hundreds of thousands of excess deaths from people who don't believe in vaccines. And so that's a mental influence on the body. And in healthcare, it's big. Related to that is I wanted to talk a little bit about one amazing technology is anesthesia. And where are we? What time is it? I don't want to get... Okay. Yeah, anesthesia is just stunning. I mean, and I think about this a lot as a psychiatrist. I'm envious of the surgeons. The surgeons are so lucky because they have anesthesia. And what they are able to do is totally extraordinary. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of operations around the world every day now that happen only because of anesthesia. Because of anesthesia, surgeons are able to, put bones back together, put metal rods into people. They're able to literally cut out their internal organs and put new organs in. If you've ever, in medical school, I got to watch some surgeries and it was just stunning. I mean, like, it's gruesome. But I mean, if you've ever watched an orthopedic surgery, I mean, it is like being down in shop and they got hammers and saws and they're pounding and hitting and, saws are going and bone spurs are going. I mean, it's really gruesome. If you were awake watching someone do that to you, you would get PTSD. And nobody would sign up to do it. I mean, it's really terrifying. But because people are put to sleep by anesthesia, they don't see it, they don't have to put up with it. They just wake up, they got a new hip, they got a new leg, they're walking, they're happy, and it's wonderful. And we can do all these, organ transplants, bone marrow transplants, really amazing stuff. Whereas in my little field of psychiatry, we do not have anesthesia. And because of that, we're able to do almost nothing because it's painful. So, for instance, the classic example I spoke about, PTSD, we have effective psychotherapies for PTSD, exposure therapy. Almost nobody completes them because it's painful emotionally to go through the process. And so our completion rates are terrible. And I work in the VA with veterans, and there are very few people who actually completed a course of treatment for PTSD and get resolution because of the pain of the process. And I wanted to share a little story of the excesses of this. Now in the United States, medicine has turned into a very customer service kind of undertaking. And so, people file complaints about doctors all the time, what they don't like about us, and we have to explain ourselves and apologize. And so this happened to me once with a patient who filed a complaint with my supervisor because I said that she looked depressed. So I sort of, called her back and set up a session to, talk about, her understanding. So I said, so, we've been talking for 6 months about depression. Every time you come and tell me how depressed you are, I prescribe antidepressants. We talk about antidepressants for depression. We do scores about whether your depression is getting worse or not, and so I'm just sort of curious, what felt so hurtful when I said to you, and then she was telling me how depressed she feels. And so I'm taught to make an empathic statement. So I said, yes, I can really see that you look depressed. And she says, well, that's what my mother tells me all the time. And I don't like that. And I said, okay, sorry, I won't say that you look depressed anymore. But that's an example of the craziness, right? I mean, I don't have anesthesia. And so someone who's being treated for depression and is telling me that they're depressed can get upset if I say, oh, I agree with you, you look depressed. Whereas surgeons can, go in, cut someone open, rip out their heart and lungs, put in a new heart and lungs, and the patient wakes up and says, thank you. So technology it's a big deal. The next area is indirect influence. And I won't talk a lot about that because others will. So that is how the mind can cooperate with other planes of consciousness that can have an influence on the body. So the vital, we'll be hearing about that. Dr. Pandey spoke a lot about the psychic, which is really critical. The psychic has much more powerful effects on the body than the mind if we can open to it. So those are indirect influences of other planes and parts of the being that are very important. And the mind can, through yoga, really one of the core practices is to quiet the mind and have a silent mind so that some of these other deeper parts of us can come under the control of the psychic and have positive influences on the body. Now, the fourth area is direct mental influence on the body, which would be, some kind of direct effect of the mind on the body. And I was thinking that, well, gee, people are probably expecting me to explain how to do this, and I don't actually know how to do it. That's the dirty little secret. And I have no doubt that it can be done. And I read about people who, have these abilities of the mind to influence the body directly. I've just never been able to do it myself. So I did want to talk a little bit about the complexities of the mind with a little story that sort of shows how complicated mental influences can be. So about 22, 24 years ago, my dear friend Ananta, who is now in the psychic kingdoms, sent me to Greece to experience the Greek gods, the overmental beings. And so that was great. I went to Greece one summer, and I was going to the temples, and I was having wonderful experiences. And I felt Apollo's presence in Delphi, and I felt Pan's presence, And then he had told me to go to Mount Lycaon, which is a pasture in some mountains in southern Greece that are supposed to be the home of Zeus, And so I went up to that pasture. I hiked up the mountain. It's in the middle of nowhere. And I got to the pasture. And there I am on top of Mount Lycaon, looking around, so wondering, well, what next? And then I look over to a tree. And by God, there is Zeus standing right next to the tree. And I had always thought Ananta was a little bit crazy, and he is crazy, but he was right. I mean, there was Zeus. And I sort of blinked, and I sort of turned around, and I looked again, and I could still see it. And it's not like sort of an internal experience of in my own mind or consciousness or an inner experience. I was literally physically seeing Zeus standing next to a tree. Now, it wasn't fully formed. It was more like an energy aura, a sort of like a subtle energy that was in the process of materializing into the physical and hadn't totally materialized yet. So details weren't there, but this very powerful being was standing there, sort of radiating this tremendous sense of power and getting more and more powerful. And I thought, wow, this is really real. There really are overmental beings. My God, these gods really exist. And then I got this really bright idea. I thought, I better take a picture of this. Nobody's going to believe me, right? But if I get a picture of this, wow, that would really be something. So then I'm sort of fumbling into, I have to get off my backpack, and my camera's at the bottom, and I get it out. And, this is in the day with, even before digital, it was, the old 35 millimeter cameras. And so I get it out and I get it all set up, and I'm still looking, and I can still see Zeus there. I'm thinking I still got time. So I get the camera up, put it up, click the picture. And when I take down the camera, Zeus is gone. Right. And when I developed the picture, there's no Zeus standing there. So I thought, wow, what an idiot. Right. I mean, what an idiot. There I am standing and watching Zeus. And what kind of idiot would, get this idea to take a picture of it? I mean, that is just not a great way to, go about doing the yoga. But it sort of shows the problems of different layers of mind, right? So there I am sort of having from one part of mind a perception of some overmental thing. Another part of my mind is sort of acting like a tourist in front of the Eiffel Tower. I'm like, oh, let's get a picture of it. So that isn't the end of the story. I came home, and I was sort of somewhat disappointed that, my picture didn't show Zeus. Ananta believed me that I saw Zeus. I mean, of course you saw Zeus. Who doesn't see Zeus? I see Zeus all the time. Why did it take you so long to see Zeus? But still I thought, well, it would have been nice to have a picture. But, some years passed, and I sort of came to terms with the fact that it was probably good that I didn't have a picture, and that this, I have to learn faith, and this is very, simplistic thinking to try to be snapping a picture of Zeus. Mother and Sri Aurobindo the letters don't say that you should take your camera when you go to a temple and try and see if you can take a picture of the god or the goddess. But then later, a few years later, I was on the internet when it was developed, and I saw that someone had there was for sale a grilled cheese sandwich that had an image of Jesus Christ in it, and there it was, great image of Jesus Christ, And so I'm thinking, God, Jesus Christ appeared in the grilled cheese sandwich in America, but Zeus wouldn't show up for me in like the picture that I took in Greece. And I started kind of wondering, and this is where you can start seeing the mind, like how the mind, and like, why is it like that? So why is it that, Jesus Christ will appear in a grilled cheese sandwich for some American guy in Michigan, but like, here I am, a faithful integral yogi, and like, I can't take a picture of Zeus. And so then you sort of wonder, like, does this sort of prove this is why Christianity beat paganism? Because, Christianity is stronger, and, therefore he could show up in the grilled cheese sandwich. Or was it that, maybe Zeus didn't want to debase himself? Like, why should I have to, sink to the level of these idiots and show up in a photograph? I'm not going to do that. And then I thought, well, maybe it's more, is it like Jesus Christ has more compassion than Zeus? Zeus didn't really sort of care about the human feelings, but Jesus Christ was very compassionate and thought, I really need to help these Americans. And so then my mind started going, and I'm thinking, well, I can just imagine sort of the conversation, like how this went, when Jesus Christ goes to talk to God. And so Jesus Christ, I imagine, he goes to God, Father, these people really need help. And he says, yeah, tell me about it. What a bunch of idiots. I've given them everything that they need, and they're just wasting it. And Jesus Christ says, Father, that's insensitive language. We don't use the word idiot anymore. We say that they have an intellectual disability and need appropriate treatment. God, right. Of course, I forgot. So what do you suggest? And remember, the last time you appeared on earth, it didn't go very well. Exactly, Father. So, that's why I was thinking that if I appeared in a grilled cheese sandwich, that would meet the developmental need of these Americans without putting me in an unsafe place, So you can just imagine silence. So you want to appear in a piece of toast? Son, I really love you, but I need a little help understanding this proposal. And Jesus Christ says, Father, just think about this, consider the alternative. If I'm supposed to support compassion and justice, and I'm born in America, I would have to, be born as like a gay guy who's half Black and half Native American and supports transgender rights, which I'm quite ready to do if you want me to do that. And so God goes, okay, all right, I see the problem, right? Let me talk to your mother about this. She made the whole universe anyway, and she runs the show. So just give me a sec. So he goes and talks to the Divine Mother, comes back. Okay, here's the deal. She's got a headache. She's not in the mood to watch another lynching or crucifixion. So she says, go with a piece of toast, start small, build on your successes, and we'll go from there. And so I have to say, I've always been an advocate of common sense. So that's kind of where the mind can take you if you let it go. It can go to lots of places. On the issue of direct mental influence, I think some people may have had more success than I did. I don't have any proof. I didn't get that picture of Zeus. And I work in a setting where I have to not rely on the picture of Zeus and just kind of go with common sense. And on that note, Sri Aurobindo has a really lovely quote that I wanted to share with you. This is about education. He said, "There's no reason why X should not complete his studies or learn something which will make him useful in life. To be useless is not a qualification for yoga. So that may be an important way in which the mind influences the body. So on that note, I will take questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for this very happy and humorous presentation on the very serious topic. Lovely, with your own story and myth and Zeus and how they would discuss Jesus and father and mother and what to do. It's very wonderful. Very wonderful. There are several questions from my side also. I would love to clarify certain statements you made. I may start with that and then come to the questions. There are two questions here waiting. So this, that mental is not immediately influencing the physical. There is a kind of gap between, and that is in the spiritual tradition, it is known as the vital world. And so mental has to form first the vitality, the living force, which in effect should kind of modify the physical and make changes. And because of that delay, most probably, that there is no direct influence.
Yes. And that's a really important point, and it's worth emphasizing. And I think it's the great thing about Mother and Sri Aurobindo's teaching is they are so clear about the existence of the vital. One of the problems I think that we face in sort of healthcare is we use this term mind-body medicine that excludes the vital. There is no term vital. There's no discussion of the vital as a being there. And I think it leads to misunderstandings. It leads people to think that there is some direct connection between the mind and the body, and forget that there's this whole vital world that is incredibly important. So yes, the vital is very important. We'll be hearing about it from Dr. Basu.
Right. And so I was thinking maybe mental disease or mental hospitals, as we usually say, it's a very kind of great approximation in a way, because mainly the disorders are on the vital level, so to say. And
that's right. And this leads to there's constant debates inside mental health whether we should even use the word mental health. Does mental health really describe what we do? I mean, isn't it more emotional health? But then behavior is very important, so we call it behavioral health. And no one can ever agree. That just the fights go, they're endless circles, they go round and round, and there's no solution. But it's a real question.
And there is this direct, with the last point from myself before I come to the questions of the audience, is that the Mother speaks about how directly to influence the body with the speech. You can speak to your parts of your body or to your organs or to your place. You can direct the will and even try to dialogue to convince the part of the body to behave differently or to accept differently the situation which it is.
And so I think that's all in that realm of training that Sri Aurobindo mentioned in the letter of, learning to walk, learning to paint, learning to play music in a bigger sense, training of consciousness, developing the passage from the psychic or the overhead planes through the mental, through the vital, to the physical, and connecting them so that they will do exactly those things. And we now know, of course, that the Mother was right, that it literally builds cellular connections. So we know that now, that new neuronal and physical cells are built in response to training practices to build those connections.
So I'm coming to the questions from the audience. What is the difference between a belief and mental formation?
Well, that's a good question. Hmm. Well, I'm not exactly sure. I would think that a belief is a mental formation. I guess maybe it's a mental formation that you believe. There might be mental formations that you don't believe. But I guess for you, if you really have the formation and believe it, I would imagine that's what a belief is. Yeah. So, I mean, in the real sense, like say for people who believe in hell, Mother talks about that. It is a mental formation, and for them, it's a real mental formation.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there can be mental belief, and there can be other types of belief. I think, mental belief is the most common, most probably, because it's reflected in the thinking and the formation of some kind of imagery and so on, words, myths, mythology.
Mythologies, right? Mm-hmm. I guess there's degrees of beliefs, right? There's small beliefs and medium beliefs and really whole belief systems that define an entire culture, or an entire worldview. But there definitely beliefs are mental formations. And as I mentioned earlier, they can be either helpful or harmful.
Mm-hmm. There is another question which is closer to your profession. Any thoughts about new studies and trials on psychedelics in healthcare?
Yes. Well, so several things. It's an interesting and complex topic. And it is evolving in exactly the way the Mother said it should in 1967. So if you go read the agenda, 1967, I think mid-ish April, somewhere in there, she talks about her experience of LSD without taking it. She decided to identify her consciousness with the molecule to see what it was that people were so interested in. And so through supramental cognition, she describes an absolutely perfect acid trip. And so it's very clear that she literally experienced it without taking the substance. So she did know what she was talking about. And she said that it's, can be quite destabilizing. And she said that if it was going to be sort of done for growth of consciousness, that it should be done in a very controlled scientific way and sort of studied carefully and so on. And she used her own terms to describe it. But basically what she was saying is that it should be done in a kind of a careful scientific fashion and studied, and because it has risks and side effects and you have to know a lot more about it. And then that didn't happen. That science was blocked because the US government put psychedelics on a no investigation list. And so science stopped, and as a result, the knowledge wasn't developed. And now that is all being undone, and so studies are starting up again on it. So we're really just at the beginning of this process of doing what she said needed to be done if you want to go down this path, which she said was not necessary at all for yoga. But if you want to go down that path, there's a safer way to do it than not. So those studies are now happening, and that's where, the first part of study is anecdotal knowledge. So there's all the anecdotal knowledge comes from traditional societies that have used it as part of healing rituals, sacred ceremonies for whatever, hundreds, 1,000 years. And that provides your base of reason to have, to believe and have stories of potential healing experiences, because lots of people have reported it. And then you need to move from there into the controlled studies, which is starting. And there have been some of those. And then they're in good scientific fashion, they're starting to play with variables. They're like sort of realizing, well, wait a second, we need to play with the dose. That's key. I mean, any medication that you're going to study, dose is everything. I mean, dose. Water is fatal if in overdose. So is oxygen. Anything can be fatal if the dose is too high, and ineffective if the dose is too low. So dose in science is everything. So they are starting to studying dose, effect, and side effect, and that's what sort of led to these. They had case reports of microdosing, and now they're starting to investigate it in a more structured fashion. Anecdotally, I've met people who microdosed and felt it helped, and people who microdosed and felt that it's not helpful. And that's true of any treatment. Name a treatment, I can tell you, someone said it helped and someone said it didn't help. What's really interesting, I just read an article I think it was from the New Yorker, from some of the leading researchers in microdosing. And one of them said that they want to get out of the field because they can't get good blinding. So when you want to do a controlled trial, you have to compare something against placebo in order to know, is your treatment performing better than placebo? And the problem is creating a real placebo is hard because they found in these microdosing studies that a lot of people could feel subtle hallucinogenic effects, and they would actually do it on their own. They would take little extra doses because they liked that little extra effect, and it made them feel like something was happening. And that ruins your placebo because you then know what you're taking. And this is, for instance, analogously, has been a huge problem in acupuncture research. How do you get a placebo? I mean, how can you do acupuncture without someone knowing that acupuncture is being done on them? And so, they have sham acupuncture is one idea that they've used. But it just sort of points to the difficulties of doing good science. But science is a slow, laborious process. But if you let it grind away, over time, it does develop knowledge and answers. So I have no doubt that 10, 20 years, we're going to be having some kind of hallucinogenic treatments available and some kind of defined dosing regimens for some kind of defined conditions. One of these studies is being done in the VA already. There's a multi-site study being done, not in our VA, but like 6 other VAs around the country. They're looking at microdosing for PTSD. So the research is being done. I also anecdotally met a woman on an airplane who had been through the whole Native American healing with peyote. What do they call it? The Native American Church. I think it's from the Sioux tribe, and they have what are called journeying men or wandering men. So these are healers who kind of go around the United States and give healing ceremonies. And she had, tried yoga, meditation, spent 10 years wandering around India, Nepal, and having experiences. And then somehow came in with the Native American Church, and she had suffered from chronic pain after a serious car accident. And she did this, and I met her she was cured. I met her on a plane to Oregon. She was coming back. She had just finished hiking all the 14,000 foot mountains in Alaska. There are people whom it helps and people whom it doesn't.
Amazing. Thank you. So with this dosage, what you say, it's coming closer to this Ayurvedic idea of that everything can be the medicine, everything. It depends on whether it fits for you in that moment of time and the dosage of it.
Right. Yes. And so let me just make a little point, not to be a bore, but I do have to. I have a public service duty as a doctor. Vaccines are homeopathy. Mm-hmm. Vaccines are probably the single best medical technology ever invented in terms of risk-benefit ratio, cost, usefulness ratio, and total number of human lives saved with a simple intervention. I mean, only sanitation beats it. Vaccines are stunning. And they are a homeopathic treatment. That's not how people think of them because of their mental ideas. But it is the truth.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
It is homeopathy. So the importance of ideas. Another way that this really comes up with me as a psychiatrist is I have so many people who come and, we talk a little bit about depression, anxiety, PTSD, then the talk turns to treatment, and maybe they do, or maybe they don't want to see a therapist, and then I sort of suggest, well, we do also have, medications. And then they say, oh no, but I want something natural, So the idea of natural has become very important, and I get it. It's at one level, but at another, it's like, I'm sitting there. Okay. So you came in your natural car, you're wearing plastic fiber clothing. You use computers, you have central heating, central air conditioning, your food is full of completely unnatural things. It's hard to find anything natural left in our lives. I mean, show me something that hasn't been genetically modified or engineered, including us, including the plants, including our pets, and it's like, all right, now let me think about that. I will do some research, and next time we'll see if I can find something natural. And I'm like, okay, well, we've got lithium, that's natural, nobody wants it. I've got ECT, that's natural, it's just a little bit of lightning, no, nobody wants that. So I struggle, with nature and something natural. But we agree to talk about it, and so that's always a good thing.
Right. So there is an interesting question. What do you think of the mind calling the mother to use her force to cure an illness?
That's great. Yeah, that's really great. That's the thing to do, for sure. So that's why it's maybe a better way of saying what I said at the beginning, which is a helpful mental formation is, for us, the recognition that our minds are limited and are probably not going to solve the problems that life gives us, and to call on the mother for help. That's the thing to do, and then try to quiet the mind so that the mother can act. Or act better. She will act anyway, but it could maybe be a little bit quicker and more pleasant if we don't fight her as much.
Mm-hmm. There is one more question here, which is kind of, there are several complex questions which I don't understand, but one of them, surely, one of the objects of developing the mind and reason is to be able to control the vital and therefore the body as well. Is it so?
Yes. No, that's an absolutely well taken point. And Sri Aurobindo touches on it in the letter on St. Augustus. If you guys want to read more about, he mentions that. He says really the ability of the mind to control the vital is what distinguishes human beings from animals at a very fundamental level. So it's incredibly important. In mental health, a lot of our treatments, that's what we're doing. In one way or another, we are helping people develop the mind's ability to regulate emotions. There are lots of different techniques, there are lots of different therapies, but when you look at what is the common bottom line for therapy across schools, that's really one of the bottom lines, is helping the mind to control and regulate the vital. It's really also important, that's what scientific research is. The scientific method is sort of a method that tries to get over the problem of the way the vital influences the mind by coming up with a research paradigm that allows you to take out what the vital wants, or what wants to believe, wants to see, wants the result, and just look at the mental, what does the data actually show? That's a mental technique. And we see it very importantly in politics, all the time, vital wishes, desires, power grabs are trying to take over the long-term good, and so we see that played out politically all the time, that the short-term wishes of the vital try to overpower the long-term interests of many people, which would be a more reasonable approach to living socially. So yes, I mean, all I can say is that is absolutely right. And it's right in many, many realms of human life. And Sri Aurobindo has written about it. So it's really, I think, important for us to remember in integral yoga that Sri Aurobindo is in no way ever recommends getting rid of reason or undermining reason. He was very careful and consistent in saying that the goal of our yoga is to rise above it, not to sink below it. And so he spoke of that as, the super rational and the infra rational was the language he used. And he says the goal of yoga is the super rational. It is not to sink into the infra rational. And that's a really important point. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's an important point also for many people who follow integral yoga, and when they condemn the mind and saying that the mind is kind of stopping them from the experiences, that they may sink down into the vital kind of realm. Yes.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But I think it's very important to remember that Sri Aurobindo supports the mind. He just says that we can also go above it. That's why I ended with this quote: there's no reason why X should not complete his studies or learn something useful, which will make him useful in life. So mental development, mental studies, they are good. They're just not the whole. We can also do more. That we should be doing that as a minimum. That's very important.
Yeah. So there are a few more questions here, but maybe I will take one of them, and then from there we would have the rest. We would keep it for the later.
Okay.
Isn't it wishing the mean cancer patients dead a vital and mental formation which would not be good for their health?
Well, yes, it is a mental vital formation, absolutely. And clearly it had no influence on their health because they kept living. And it's, this has been proved. I talked about how women with, negative expectations of survival didn't live any shorter. It's proved also, I work with suicidal patients. There are a lot of people who have recurrent suicidal thoughts, and they're not dropping dead from those thoughts. So that's the point. There is not necessarily a direct connection between thoughts, emotions, and the body. It is more complicated. And for the average human being, when we actually study it, the effect that we find is behavior. So behavior has an enormous effect on the body. For instance, if because I was sick of this obnoxious personality disordered person who's yelling at staff all the time and screaming and insulting everybody, if I acted out by then refusing to give them their medication and they died, that's what would kill them. It wasn't my thought, it was my action, which is why in medical practice, it's, we understand, it's okay to have thoughts and feelings that are negative, neutral, mixed, upset, angry. We're human. It happens all the time. And so the solution to that is come talk to other colleagues about those feelings so that we don't act on them. Mm-hmm. So that's what supervision is. And that's why we need it, whether it's in physical medicine or psychological medicine. Supervision is key so that people have a place to talk about their thoughts and feelings without acting on them. Mm. And then when you've had a chance to process all those feelings, you can finally say, Mr. Jones down the hall is a complete racist jerk, but I'm going to go down there and I'm going to provide good medical care. Mm. So I'm going to listen to him. He's going to get his pain treatment. He's going to get his anxiety meds. We will treat him respectfully. We're not going to yell at him. We're not going to insult him back, even though he's insulting us. And really, that's what medical ethics is. It is separating thought and feeling from action so that we don't act out on our negative thoughts and feelings. And it's not perfect, but it's incredibly important.
So true, especially now in the war, when these, the enemies are taken into the hospitals. Our doctors in Ukraine are there; they're healing them and they're taking care of them. So, and though these are enemies, but they are treated as human beings, as if they were their own soldiers.
Yeah, that is really true. That is the heart and soul of medical ethics, is that. And I'll give you, to close, one short story, most amazing story. I read about this. This is in the 1920s. When Hitler was rising, he was imprisoned for something, some crime that he had done, and he needed a mental health evaluation. And the psychiatrist who was called to see him was Jewish.
Mm.
And this guy did an evaluation of him and said, he's very dangerous, but he let him walk. He said he's not psychotic. He does not have schizophrenia. We cannot hold him here on the basis of mental illness, and we have to let him go. And he didn't know what he was going to do. But years later, he said he had no regrets. He said, that's medical ethics, and if I don't practice that, then what is there left, right? Nothing. So what a story. Jewish psychiatrist who let Hitler walk. He could have locked him away on a false charge, but he didn't. And so it's just a reminder as to what you're saying, the importance of, we have thoughts and feelings that can be very strong. And that's why in medical practice, we try to find ways to talk about it so that we don't act out, on our worst feelings. And in a long picture, in a big picture, in a slow way, that's what democracy is trying to do. It's trying to give people ways of talking about things and sorting them out, as opposed to just, okay, this is the law, this is the way it's going to be. One perspective, that's it. No more discussion. Good reminder.
The power of truth is winning all, conquering all. Yes.
So,
Thank you for this. This was a wonderful session, and we are very happy to have you with us, and looking forward to interact in the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all the great questions. All right.
Thank you. Thank you also, Michael. And just before people leave, I just wanted to let them know that we have finalized the dates for our Shiobindo Integral Yoga Retreat, which will be June 29th through July 3rd. I have put a link there to LaGrasse's website where you can learn more and also take advantage of some early bird discount rates that we're offering. And we really hope to see you there. Again, thank you, Michael, so very, very much. Always wonderful to have you on New Perspectives.
Thank you.